welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode in our Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts series. In this episode, we're looking at part 2 of Mr. Sin, King of the Cross, Abe Saffron. Now, we left off part 1 as he was just building his empire. Abe is born to Jewish Russian parents and has 3 older siblings and a younger sibling. The family is close, and the father, Sam, shows the kids at an early age how to make money illegally when times are tough, selling various items at higher prices on the black market to keep the family afloat during Depression times. The kids embrace this, none more so than Abe Saffron, who early on has a knack for making large profits off people. At school, as well as in the army, money is important, and money means power. He aligns himself with like-minded people, such as his best friend Kincaid, and together they buy up many pubs and clubs in the Sydney area after a little stint in Newcastle. Now it is believed that the family works together. Sam, the father, before his death in 1949, still making money, helps Abe wherever he can. As to the siblings, when it comes to the fact they could only have one license under their name, the siblings jump in to help Abe in his empire. Henry, Philip and Beryl all have pubs and clubs for Abe under their own names, and Abe selects close friends to help him and have clubs under dummy names. Some he can trust, others, it turns out later on, he can't. But it works for a time, until the Maxwell Royal Commission comes into play in the early 1950s. Abe is in and out of court for various disputes, mainly the fact that he's selling alcohol at higher prices. This is a time when you couldn't find alcohol after the curfew of 6 p.m, and he was selling it out of his pubs and clubs, especially the Roosevelt Club, where he would sell bottles to some of his favourite customers, but at astronomical prices. Well, if you wanted alcohol after 6 p.m, you knew where to find it if you had the money. Now, while Abe is doing this, he is also setting up other ventures. He, at the Roosevelt Club, has parties in the name of raising money for charities, as well as opening up some bingo houses known as Housey, where people could win prizes, but the money was supposed to be going to charity, and the newspapers would declare that the charities were not getting as much as they were meant to be getting, and they attack Abe, and once again he is in and out of court. There had to be a better way. Abe needed friends in higher places. He needed to be able to ensure he wasn't spending most of his time in court. There was money to be made. And yes, he could pay lawyers to try and get him out of strife, but there was an easier way, aligning himself with people who, yes, he would have to pay, but that he could avoid court altogether. Abe paid bribes to police on a regular basis, including Ray Kelly, but also others to ensure that licensing and other laws were not enforced against any of the premises in which he had an interest, and a heads up if there were to be raids on his premises. Especially since from the late 40s, he would have had prostitution in some of his venues, opening the door for servicemen on leave after the war, initially, and then to others who wanted to discreetly be with women. This would be a little less discreet later on. The Roosevelt Club brings an opportunity to have dancing girls following in the footsteps of Sammy Lee. He makes sure that the experience inside the clubs is one that his customers won't forget. But it does seem to err on the side of explicit. The acts become more sexualized, and he offers his customers private shows, even involving himself whipping and in lewd acts with some of the dancing girls. Some of this even spills out to outside the clubs and in different locations in Sydney, sex parties and things he wouldn't want his wife knowing about, but I'm sure she found out. His name is in the headlines again. At first, the community is split, some believing that he's a lovely man who donates to charity with a wife and family. And then there's others that read the other newspapers, where he's a depraved man who does sexual acts in public, and his clubs are disgusting. But Abe still makes a killing. Abe's son, Alan, grows up watching all these dealings that Abe's having with these friends in high places. As Alan is getting older, Abe actually has him helping out with the business, including putting cash inside of sometimes up to 20 envelopes for those who he needed to pay in order to keep him out of jail and the courtroom.
But I will tell you, one of them is Bob Askin and one of them is Commissioner Allen. He said, the rest you don't need to know.
But this was an agreement that he'd come to based on blackmail. Many knew about the clubs that had peepholes or mirrors that you could see right through into a room, especially if someone, say, high-ranking, is in there with a lady getting a dance, or possibly something even more raunchy. Abe probably filmed it.
His friends would go in there and other friends would look through the peepholes. They were compromised, so I think he blackmailed them. They were having sex and all sorts of nonsense, and they were being filmed. So Abe would say, well, you do me a favour and I won't let this get out, sort of thing. That's the sort of thing that happened.
His way of ensuring that the deal he wanted would go ahead.
In my safety deposit and in my lawyer's safety deposit, I have photos that would turn anyone's head of sex acts with high-ranking politicians and police who are still alive today and who are still in the police and are still in the government today.
It was a deadly game, the blackmail. And then he needed security. And he found James McCartney Anderson. He'd had some bouncers in the day who would knock back any of the riffraff coming into his clubs, like ex-boxers. But James Anderson was a different breed altogether. Ruthless. He wasn't just a hard hitter, he was also a murderer. But we'll get into that a little later. James was even known to intimidate the girls, making sure that they did what they were meant to do.
I remember one time he came to the dressing room and some of the girls were mucking up. And he pulled a gun out. And he said, you girls can play your game. He said, I can play mine. Your choice. And then just turned around and walked out. The girls didn't play up much after that, I can assure you.
He had so many clubs. He needed someone of that kind of animalistic behaviour.
Abe appointed James as a manager for many of his clubs. Not only did he manage the clubs, but he also collected. He was like Abe's enforcer. Some feared James more than they actually feared Abe.
Paid possibly between $5 and $6 million over a 15-year period to Abe Saffron to pay the police and the politicians.
Things are strained at home. The family is going through something awful. A child is born to one of Abe's dancers, and she says it's his child. Doreen was accustomed to a life she couldn't have without Abe. There was also their son, Alan, to think about, his education and business or career. Doreen could not leave Abe despite knowing what he did. Baby Melissa being born, and much later it comes out that there had been another son, Adam, to one of his other mistresses, was had behind her back. And not only was he having affairs behind his mother's back, when Alan was first married, Doreen insisted that they lived with them to save money. But it comes out that Abe has an affair with Alan's wife. They're divorced. But despite everything, Doreen still stays with Abe. Son Alan says his mother tried to commit suicide with pills on several occasions, and that he feels his dad was the cause of her eventual death a little later on.
She tried to commit suicide 3 times. I am absolutely convinced that my father killed my mother, broke her heart, and caused her to stop the desire for living. I just guess she didn't want to fight it.
My grandmother was dosed on Xanax and all kinds of different pills that she was taking. She was always very happy, but completely out of it, clearly out of it, just not caring. It's like sort of like living your life numb.
He truly was an evil man, but it didn't seem to slow him down. He was buying up more properties too. He was the first in Australia to open up a strip club in 1959 and named the Staccato Club.
It would be in the 50s, and with my age now, it's a wee bit hard to remember, Dave, but my best friend in those days was a man called Louis Benedetto, nicknamed Last Card Louis.
The manager of the Pink Pussycat is known around the cross as Last Card Louis.
Yes, I've been in it a very, very long time. As a matter of fact, I've seen the show 39,000 times. Don't know what to think about it, to tell you the truth. It's a good job. I like the atmosphere about it and the excitement about it.
So then Louis says, listen, he says, this guy, Abe Saffron, has got a couple of clubs in the Cross, the Roosevelt and that. He says, we'll try and con him to back us to run this club. Abe did like a lady. We opened the club, which was above a place they called the Hasty Tasty. Or as we used to call it, the Spit and Spew, because that's what they used to do after they had the hamburger. That is now, today, is where the Coca-Cola sign is in King's Cross.
Right.
And from there, that was my meeting with Abe, was he backed us, put us in for a percentage, of course, we percentage, but I then went to work for Abe as his right-hand man for, well, I suppose a good 15-odd years, through trials and tribulations, funds and disasters.
Abe Saffron seemed untouchable. Not much could hurt him while he was paying off the police, politicians, and he had James or Jim Anderson, his thug, ready to take on anyone who stood in his way. He had Wayne Martin and Last Card Louis working for him. He eventually took lay girls as well, after raising the rent so high they couldn't do it themselves anymore, and Sammy Lee had since retired. Abe became King of the Cross, and as the 70s came in, he was also known as Mr. Sin. His charitable persona through the community now long gone. Strip clubs open throughout King's Cross. He owned most of the clubs now, and other real estate as well, where he had prostitution running from. He couldn't mix the prostitution too much with his clubs, or they'd all be shut down. And he made it his point of distancing himself from the dirty work, employing people to manage these clubs on behalf of him, Jim Anderson now manages many of the strip clubs. Not only was Jim the manager now, as well as the enforcer, he was also hurting people inside the clubs, stating that he was there to protect the patrons.
I was reasonably fit. I wouldn't stand any nonsense. In those days, you used to get quite a lot of girls getting beaten up in the clubs, customers getting robbed. I put a stop to that. And again, there's a certain amount of respect is not to trifle with them.
Others don't agree, believing that Jim was a murderer who took out anyone in Abe's way as well as his own.
He was a horrible, horrible man. Like, if anyone wanted to big note themselves, Jimmy did.
Anderson was a monster and shady character. He was just evil.
For now at least, Abe can't lose. He is so powerful and rich, and he teams up with developers, his eyes still on King's Cross and the surrounding suburbs. He wants to build, or to assist build, some high-rise buildings worth more money than the little terraces that's in there at the moment. But there's a woman, an activist, who stands squarely in his way. She was Juanita Nielsen, an heiress to the Mark Foy retail department store empire that used to be in Sydney decades before, similar to a David Jones or Myers, and she doesn't want to see this beautiful old building reduced to rubble just because developers want to build. Together with other residents in the area, they protest, trying to save those houses on Victoria Street. But it's a losing battle because the police and the government are in Abe Saffron's pocket. Police, under the instruction of the Askin government, and we know that Askin is corrupt as anything, have police evict many of the residents on Victoria Street by force, and the hired goons start taking apart the houses. Juanita Nielsen has a magazine called Now, and she makes it a point of using her magazine to protest against the developers. One of the head protesters goes missing for 2 days, and when he returns, he says nothing but leaves immediately. Later on, we learn that he was roughed up, and he believes it was by Abe Saffron's goons. They parked him outside the Carousel Club, and he could see while he was tied up in the boot where he was. They allowed him to live so long as he moved away. And then the unthinkable happened. Fires are being started in some of the remaining houses where some of the residents who had already been evicted and their houses removed have been squatting. A fire breaks out and a young Aboriginal woman loses her life. Esther George, who'd come down from Queensland and was staying with her friend Joseph Mick, another Aboriginal man living in 103 Victoria Street. The night of the fire, they had met up with a white man who is unnamed at Central Station. They sat together and drank for a little while and continued at Joseph Mick's place at 103 Victoria Street. There, in the early hours of the morning, a fire broke out. It is strongly believed that the white man that they had been drinking with had lit the fire, probably on the instruction of the hired goons or Abe Saffron. The fire swept through the house. Joseph Mick, luckily enough, was able to get to the window and climb out. He called to Esther George, but she did not respond. Sadly, she lost her life when she was overcome by the smoke and the flames. Then, the police tried to pin the fire on Joseph Mick. Why would he set fire to his own home? Sure, he may not have owned it. He may have been squatting there. But it was where he lived. All of his contents were inside, whatever he had. Luckily, a nurse by the name of Kay, who was familiar with Joseph Mick, came to his rescue when she entered the police station to give evidence of her own. They told her that he was going to be arrested for lighting the fire. He'd given a confession and was ready to sign. And Kay thought that was quite strange because the man was illiterate, couldn't read or write. The police were trying to pin the murder and the fire on Joseph Mick, an innocent Aboriginal man. The residents are appalled at the lengths that these developers and Mr. Sin will go to. But just when they thought things couldn't get any worse, they do. On the 4th of July 1975, Juanita Nielsen goes missing. But unlike the other resident who was released, she never returns. And the residents of the area know they've killed her for what she believed in. There's an uproar in the newspapers. People know something's happened. Everybody knows Juanita Nielsen's been murdered, but there's no body, and there never will be. An investigation is launched. After all, she is an heiress. But police have few leads, only what her boyfriend was able to tell them. He believed that she was tricked into a meeting where the night manager of the Carousel Club, owned by Abe Saffron, was to meet with her to go over advertising for their businesses in her magazine. Surely she was smart enough to see through this, or they hid who they were really well. There is quite a lot that goes into this disappearance, and we're definitely going to have an episode dedicated to Juanita and her disappearance a little bit later. There is so much more to discuss about Abe Saffron, and some more traumatic events to come before it's completely concluded. And will it ever be concluded, I wonder? So much is left unsaid and unsolved. But join us in part 3, when we finally end Abe Saffron's reign on Sydney. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and you know what to do about the notification bell. Don't miss out on part 3.
Meeting was to be at the Lido Motel at lunchtime on the 4th of July 1975, and she went there and she was killed there, and they cut her into pieces and put the pieces down an incinerator, and we know that's what happened. We absolutely know.